January 24, 1945. A frozen irrigation ditch near Huzen, France. The telephone felt like ice against First Lieutenant Garlin Merl Connor's ear as he whispered coordinates, his breath forming tiny clouds in the freezing air. Around him, the ground shook. Not from enemy fire, but from American artillery he was calling down on his own position. Years later, he would write simply, "I knew what had to be done. The men behind me had families waiting. If those tanks got through, none of us would make it home." Through the morning mist, Connor watched something that defied everything he thought he knew about defense. 6 massive German Tiger tanks, each 54 tons and armed with 80mm cannons, rolled straight toward the shallow ditch where he lay. Behind them, 600 battle-hardened German soldiers, veterans of the Eastern Front, advanced with the confidence of men certain of victory. Connor, a Kentucky farmer's son with only an 8th-grade education, was about to make a choice that military historians would study for decades. 400 yards behind him, men of the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, held their defensive positions, cold, tired, facing overwhelming odds. None of them knew their survival rested entirely on one man in a ditch willing to risk everything. The math of this battle broke every conventional rule. One man with a phone and artillery coordinates would stop an entire armored column. Garlin Merl Connor was born June 2, 1919, on Indian Creek in Clinton County, Kentucky, the third of 11 children. He grew up on a subsistence farm in the Appalachian foothills. His parents called him by his middle name, Merle, and it stuck for life. With the nearest high school 15 miles away over rough mountain roads, Connor left school after 8th grade to help on the farm. There, he learned lessons no classroom could teach: patience, endurance, and an understanding of terrain that would later save lives. Before the war, he knew the rhythm of farm life, reading weather, working the land, making do with what was at hand. During the Great Depression, life got harder, but Connor joined the Civilian Conservation Corps. Part of Roosevelt's New Deal, learning discipline, teamwork, and how to work with men from different backgrounds, skills he would carry into the Army. On March 1, 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, Connor enlisted in the U.S. Army in Louisville, Kentucky. He was 21, 5'9", 145 pounds, with a quiet determination his fellow soldiers would come to respect. Assigned to Company K, 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, he completed basic training at Fort Lewis, Washington. Connor didn't seek attention. He just did his job fully and without complaint. On October 23, 1942, Connor and his division sailed from Norfolk, Virginia, heading for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. 16 days later, on November 8th, they landed at Fadala, Morocco, beginning one of the longest U.S. combat deployments in the war. North Africa was brutal. Temperatures soared to 120 degrees by day, dropped at night. Water was scarce, disease was rampant, and enemy fire was constant. Connor found something remarkable about himself. He stayed calm under fire when others panicked. The division pushed east, fighting Germans and Italians until May 1943. Connor earned his first Silver Star for gallantry in October 1943, leading a reconnaissance patrol that identified enemy positions while heavily outnumbered. The terrain lessons from Kentucky proved invaluable in the deserts and ridges of Tunisia. In July 1943, Connor's division invaded Sicily. House-to-house fighting with entrenched German defenders caused heavy casualties. Connor pressed forward, earning the respect of men who recognized courage when they saw it. Italy brought the ultimate test. On September 9, 1943, the 3rd Infantry Division landed at Salerno. Germans were prepared, and the battle for the beachhead lasted days, with counterattacks threatening to push the Allies back into the sea. Connor fought for 72 hours straight, holding positions, leading counterattacks, and rescuing wounded men. He earned his second Silver Star for heroism under extreme conditions. The campaign in Italy was a grinding advance. In January 1944, the division landed at Anzio, which turned into a 4-month siege. Connor earned a 3rd Silver Star on January 30, 1944, for leading an assault under heavy mortar fire. He was wounded on March 6 but refused evacuation. By summer 1944, after 18 months of continuous combat, he was promoted to technical sergeant, recognized for keeping men alive while completing missions. Despite further wounds in August and September, He stayed with his men, becoming a soldier whose presence reassured everyone. In August 1944, the 3rd Infantry Division moved from Italy to southern France for another amphibious operation. On August 15th, Operation Dragoon began. The division pushed north through the Rhone Valley, liberating French towns along the way. Connor's exceptional leadership earned him a battlefield commission. On September 11, 1944, he became 2nd Lieutenant Garlin Merl Connor and earned his 4th Silver Star for leading an assault across 300 yards of fire-swept ground. By late November 1944, the 3rd Infantry Division had reached Strasbourg, the first Allied unit at the Rhine, but the Germans still held the Colmar pocket, a 65-kilometer-long, 50-kilometer deep area west of the river centered on the town of Colmar. The French First Army, with American units attached, would eliminate it. The winter of 1944-45 was one of Europe's coldest. Temperatures in Alsace dropped to 20 degrees C, snow piled 3 feet deep. Exhausted after 2 years of continuous combat, the 3rd Infantry Division took up positions in the frozen landscape in mid-December. Lieutenant Connor served as the battalion intelligence officer, the S2, preparing for what would become one of the most studied acts of heroism in U.S. military history. This role put Connor in charge of collecting and analyzing enemy information, positions, strength, and intentions. He excelled at it, often going forward himself to scout German positions, taking risks most intelligence officers would leave to others. On January 20, 1945, French forces began their push to clear the Colmar pocket. The 3rd Infantry Division was tasked with attacking southeast, crossing the Ill River, bypassing Colmar to the north, and opening the way for French armored divisions to reach the Rhine. Connor's battalion made slow progress through January 22nd and 23rd, battling freezing cold and determined German resistance. By the evening of January 23rd, they held positions near Husen, a small village northwest of Colmar. Intelligence suggested the Germans were retreating, but nothing could have prepared them for what came next. On the morning of January 24th, the sun struggled to rise through heavy clouds. Temperatures hovered around 15 degrees C. Around 8 a.m., forward observers spotted movement in the woods to the east. Moments later, the full scale of the German attack became clear. 6 Tiger tanks, their wide tracks crushing snow, rolled out of the tree line, followed by waves of infantry. The tanks' 80 mm cannons began pounding American positions. At Battalion HQ, Major Ramsey realized the situation was dire. Their positions weren't prepared for an attack of this magnitude. The only weapon capable of stopping the tanks was artillery, but it required accurate observation. That meant someone had to go forward, into the open, directly in the path of German fire. Volunteers were called. Going forward meant facing artillery, machine guns, rifles, and tank fire, placing oneself beyond the American line, where death or capture was almost certain. Lieutenant Connor stepped forward without hesitation. At 25, he had survived 28 months of continuous combat, earning 4 Silver Stars, 3 Purple Hearts, and the Distinguished Service Cross. He could have let someone else take the risk. Instead, he grabbed a telephone, a radio, and a spool of wire ready to move. Private Robert Doodle volunteered to help, unreeling the wire as they ran toward the enemy. German artillery shells rained down, throwing snow and frozen earth high into the air. Connor zigzagged across the open ground, unreeling the wire, keeping the communication line with HQ intact. Doodle managed the first 200 yards, then had to fall back under the intensity of fire. Connor pressed on alone. Eyewitnesses later described trees exploding around him, yet he kept moving, staggering but determined, driven by a courage that seemed superhuman. Sergeant Harold Miller, observing from HQ, later wrote, "He just kept going. Shells were landing all around him, and he just kept going forward." Connor reached the American front line but didn't stop. He advanced another 30 yards to a shallow irrigation ditch, barely 18 inches deep, enough to shield him from small arms fire but leaving him fully exposed to everything else. From there, he had an unobstructed view of the advancing Germans. 6 massive Tigers rolled toward him, with 600 veterans of the Eastern Front in winter camouflage trailing behind. Connor calmly began calling in artillery fire. The American guns, 105mm howitzers and 155mm pieces several miles to the rear, depended entirely on him to see the target. "Drop 100, left 50, he would say, his voice steady amid the chaos. Shells began hitting the German formation, damaging tanks, tracks, and equipment and wreaking havoc on the infantry. The snow offered little cover, and casualties quickly mounted. Connor continued adjusting fire, calm and precise despite being surrounded by the sounds of artillery, tank cannons, and machine guns. A German soldier came within 5 yards of Connor before being shot by an American defender. Shells struck near the ditch, spraying debris, and bullets kicked up snow along the edges. For 3 hours he stayed low, continuing to direct fire. Lieutenant Harold Wiggitman later recalled Connor's icy self-control. He kept telephoning his directions. Although he must have known the Germans could have killed him at any moment, the Germans attacked in waves. Each time they regrouped, Connor directed artillery onto their positions with deadly effect. His knowledge of terrain and calm under pressure allowed him to correct fire accurately even as the battlefield erupted around him. The final assault came as the Germans threw everything at the American line. 6 Tigers rumbled forward at full speed, infantry charging behind them. Major Ramsey, watching from HQ, realized Connor's position might be overrun and ordered him to withdraw. Connor refused. "No, sir, blanket my position," he said. In forward observer terms, this meant calling all available artillery onto his own location, a last resort tactic, used only when being overrun, prioritizing the destruction of the enemy over one's own life. Ramsey understood the cost, but also the stakes. He gave the order. Every artillery piece in range unleashed fire on Connor's coordinates. What followed was one of the most intense artillery barrages of the Colmar pocket campaign. Shells from 105mm and 155mm howitzers rained down on Connor's irrigation ditch. Observers later described the roar as continuous, shaking the ground and whipping snow and smoke into a blinding storm. The German attack vanished into the chaos. Connor, lying in the ditch as shells exploded mere feet from him, continued to adjust fire. Accounts describe how near misses left him deaf and dazed, how shrapnel sprayed all around him. But he didn't stop. His telephone stayed connected, his voice calm and professional as he directed artillery onto the advancing Germans. The attack faltered. The Tigers and their infantry, battered and broken, began to retreat. Survivors fled through the snow, leaving the dead and wounded behind. The American line held. When the barrage ended, silence fell. The fields were cratered. Bodies littered the approach routes, and none of the 6 Tiger tanks had reached American positions. Soldiers cautiously moved forward and found Connor still in his ditch, covered in dirt and snow, uniform torn by shell fragments, but alive. He had multiple small wounds, severe shell shock, hearing loss, and trembled from cold and adrenaline, but he had survived. The German losses were staggering. About 50 killed, over 100 wounded, 6 Tiger tanks destroyed or captured. The 600-man assault force was shattered, and the threat to the 3rd Division's advance eliminated. Major Ramsey immediately recommended Connor for the Medal of Honor. In a letter he wrote, "I've never seen a man with as much courage and ability as he had. I usually don't brag on my officers, but this is one officer nobody could brag enough about." The Medal of Honor recommendation eventually became the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's 2nd highest award for valor. Reasons for the downgrade remain unclear, though some historians note that another soldier, Audie Murphy, performed a similar action just 2 days later and received the Medal of Honor. On February 10, 1945, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch personally presented Connor with the Distinguished Service Cross at Division Headquarters. But his combat didn't end there. On February 3rd, he led a disorganized rifle company over 200 yards of fire-swept ground, killing 12 Germans and capturing 75, earning his 4th Silver Star. By March 1945, the Army recognized that Connor had given everything. He had fought 28 straight months in 10 campaigns and 4 amphibious landings, wounded officially 3 times, though he claimed 7. His military records, which could have clarified the details, were lost in a 1973 fire at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. Connor returned home to Clinton County, Kentucky, in June 1945, where the community celebrated him. Sergeant Alvin C. York, World War I, Medal of Honor recipient, traveled to honor the young hero. Among the crowd was 15-year-old Pauline Wells, who later recalled, "My God, Mamar, that little guy couldn't have done all of what they said he'd done." Connor, persistent, visited the Wells farm daily. On July 9, 1945, he married Pauline, then 16 while he was 26. The couple settled on Indian Creek near Albany, Kentucky. Their home had no electricity or running water, and they farmed with mules and horses. In 1950, the government purchased their land for Lake Cumberland, and they relocated to Roland, running a 36-acre farm. Connor never spoke about the war. He refused to watch war movies, avoided veterans' gatherings, and would close windows during 4th of July fireworks. His son Paul grew up knowing little about his father's service. A photograph of young Connor in uniform with ribbons was on the wall, but questions were met with a change of subject. He channeled his leadership into civilian life, serving 17 years as president of the Clinton County Farm Bureau and helping disabled veterans navigate the VA system alongside Pauline. The war had left its mark. He walked with a limp, endured lingering injuries, hearing problems, and trauma, what we now recognize as PTSD. Pauline later said, "If anybody ever had PTSD, he did, because he'd wake up in the night with nightmares." Connor died on November 5, 1998, at 79, after battling kidney failure and diabetes. He was buried in Memorial Hill Cemetery in Albany, Kentucky. Only a small group of veterans and family attended the funeral, a quiet farewell for a man whose heroism had saved hundreds. Decades later, in 1996, former Green Beret Richard Chilton contacted the Connor family while researching his uncle, Private Gordon Roberts, who had served in Connor's unit and died at Anzio. Pauline directed him to Connor's military records, stored in a cardboard box in the closet. Chilton discovered the full scope of Connor's heroism: 4 silver stars, the Distinguished Service Cross, Purple Hearts, citations, letters from commanders, and eyewitness statements of January 24, 1945. Chilton, a decorated veteran, began a campaign to have Connor's Distinguished Service Cross upgraded to the Medal of Honor. He was joined by Connor's cousin, attorney Luther Connor, and neighbor Walton Chip Haddox. The effort faced immediate obstacles. Military rules required Medal of Honor nominations to be submitted within 3 years of the action. Connor's heroism had occurred more than 50 years earlier. The Medal of Honor campaign faced enormous hurdles. Connor's original recommendation had already been submitted and reduced to the Distinguished Service Cross. The team discovered that sworn statements from 3 eyewitnesses, First Sergeant Harold Miller, Lieutenant Harold Weigertman, and Private Robert Doodle, had been signed just 16 days after Connor's action, on February 9, 1945. Yet the Army Board for Correction of Military Records had never reviewed them. A formal request was submitted in 1997, but the board rejected it, citing the passage of time. An appeal in 2000 was also denied. Pauline Connor, devastated but determined, refused to give up. Over the years, military historians like Doug Sterner examined the case and concluded Connor deserved the Medal of Honor. Kentucky members of Congress, including Senator Mitch McConnell, lent their support, and World War II authors included his story in their works. In 2014, a Kentucky district court ruled Connor ineligible due to a technicality. Pauline had waited too long to present evidence. The legal battle seemed lost, but she persisted. In 2015, new documents emerged from the National Archives corroborating eyewitness accounts. The Army Board for Correction of Military Records reversed its earlier decisions and recommended Connor's Distinguished Service Cross be upgraded. In 2017, the recommendation reached the Secretary of the Army, who approved it. To ensure action, the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act included a waiver of the time limit for awarding the Medal of Honor to Connor for his January 24, 1945 actions. On March 29, 2018, the White House announced that President Donald Trump would award the Medal of Honor posthumously. Because Connor had died 20 years earlier, the medal was presented to his widow, Pauline, then 89. The ceremony took place on June 26, 2018, in the East Room of the White House. Pauline attended with her son, Paul, 4 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. Richard Chilton, who had begun the campaign 22 years earlier, was there, as were Walton Haddox and Luther Connor. Senator Mitch McConnell and other Kentucky representatives witnessed the honor. President Trump read Connor's citation and spoke of the Kentucky farm boy who became one of the war's greatest heroes. "We pay tribute to this Kentucky farm boy who stared down evil with the strength of a warrior and the heart of a true hero." He quoted Major Ramsey. "There is no doubt that Lieutenant Connor should have been awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions. One of the most disappointing regrets of my career is not having the Medal of Honor, awarded to the most outstanding soldier I've ever had the privilege of commanding. Pauline accepted the medal in a room filled with military officers, government officials, and family members. It represented not only her husband's courage, but her own relentless pursuit to ensure his story was remembered. The medal is now displayed at the Kentucky Military History Museum in Frankfort. In 2012, the U.S. Army had already honored Connor by naming a maintenance facility at Fort Benning, Georgia, Connor Hall. Connor's life reflects fundamental truths about heroism. A subsistence farmer's son with only an 8th grade education made split-second decisions under pressure that saved hundreds of lives. His upbringing in rural Kentucky, once thought a disadvantage, had given him patience, terrain reading skills, and an unbreakable work ethic. One man, armed only with a telephone and his artillery knowledge, stopped 6 tanks and 600 infantrymen. The artillery he directed killed around 50 enemy soldiers and wounded over 100, halting the German attack at a critical moment. Had the counterattack succeeded, it could have destroyed the 3rd Battalion and reversed the Allied advance. Connor's choice to call artillery on his own position went beyond tactical calculation. It was a moral decision to place the lives of others above his own. Military ethicists study it as the ultimate expression of the warrior ethos, a willingness to die so others might live. The broader Colmar Pocket Campaign from January 20th to February 9th, 1945, saw roughly 15,000 Allied casualties, including 2,000 killed. The 3rd Infantry Division alone suffered more than 2,000 casualties. Eliminating the pocket was strategically vital, allowing Allied forces to concentrate for the final push into Germany. Connor's story also highlights the flaws in military recognition. Medals often fail to match actual heroism. Bureaucracy, timing, leadership, and luck can determine awards. Connor performed Medal of Honor level actions on January 24, 1945, yet received the Distinguished Service Cross. Only through extraordinary persistence and rediscovery of lost documentation was the record corrected 73 years later. His silence about the war reflects the humility of his generation. He could have told his story, leveraged his fame, or sought recognition. Instead, he became a farmer, husband, father, and neighbor. His experience offers a rare window into the lives of millions who served. Fear, exhaustion, moral choices, and trauma. Connor's life teaches that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. No special training, elite skills, or destiny was required. Just the courage to act, to put others first, and to persist against impossible odds. On January 24, 1945, Connor took what military doctrine called a suicidal risk. He called artillery fire on his own position and survived. He proved that sometimes the impossible action is the only action that will work, and that a single person, in the right place with the will to act, can change the course of history. His legacy isn't marked by monuments or statues, but by the lives saved on January 24, 1945. The men of the 3rd Battalion who survived that day went on to live full lives, raise families, and contribute to their communities. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren exist in part because of the courage of a man most of them never knew. This ripple effect is the true measure of Connor's impact, one act of bravery creating consequences that span generations. The Medal of Honor that Pauline Connor received on June 26, 2018, bears the inscription, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty." Those words perfectly capture what Connor did. He went beyond duty, beyond what anyone could reasonably ask, fully aware of the likely cost. The story of Garlin Merl Connor is ultimately a story of redemption, not his own, for he lived and acted with honor, but of a system that initially failed to recognize his heroism, only to correct that mistake decades later. It is the redemption of a family that refused to let their father and husband's story be forgotten, and it is the redemption of a nation that, 73 years after the fact, finally acknowledged the debt owed to a Kentucky farmer's son who stopped a German tank column in a frozen field in France. The idea wasn't reckless, it was necessary. And on January 24, 1945, Garlin Merl Connor proved it. That courage and that proof echo across the decades as a testament to what ordinary people can achieve when they choose to be extraordinary.